Africa was once called the Dark Continent. Dark, not because the sun wasn't shining. Obviously, Africa gets enough sunlight to make your phone battery feel unemployed. So what exactly was supposed to be dark? The people, the civilizations, the knowledge, the history, or perhaps the problem was simply that someone else was holding the camera. And here's the question I want us to investigate. After centuries of other people defining us, have we actually developed the habit of defining ourselves? Let's talk history. For centuries, much of what the outside world knew, or claimed to know, about Africa was filtered through explorers, missionaries, colonial administrators, and later Western historians. And somewhere along the way, a very convenient story emerged. Africa was backward. Africa had no serious civilization. Africa had little intellectual history. Africa needed to be discovered. Except, Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered. People were already here, building kingdoms, trading, farming, engineering, writing, creating systems of government, producing art, studying the stars, and arguing about politics. Because apparently humans have been arguing about politics since the beginning of time. Some things are truly universal. But here's where the situation becomes interesting. We often imagine history as something happened. Historians recorded it. We learned it. Simple. Except history doesn't work like CCTV footage. Someone decides what gets recorded, what gets preserved, what gets taught, what gets translated, what gets funded, and what gets forgotten. And when generations grow up reading mostly about Africa through someone else's archive, something strange happens. We begin to confuse absence from the textbook with absence from history. That's the illusion. Now let's flip the investigation. What happens when we stop asking, what did the world say Africa contributed? And start asking, what did we Africans actually create, discover, build, preserve, and contribute? Suddenly, the picture gets complicated. You encounter ancient African cities, sophisticated trade networks, mathematical knowledge, metallurgy, philosophical traditions, libraries and manuscripts, and kingdoms whose political and economic systems were far more sophisticated than the cartoon version of African history many of us inherited. The problem isn't that Africa has no story. The problem may be that we Africans haven't investigated enough of it. Here's a fact that might surprise you. Timbuktu wasn't simply some mysterious desert town. At its height, it was a major intellectual and commercial center. Scholars studied subjects ranging from law and theology to mathematics, astronomy and literature. And thousands of historic manuscripts survived. Think about that. Also, there were African queens that ruled empires before Europe, example Queen of Sheba. How much do we Africans care to know about our history? So the issue is not, Africa, please present evidence that you are human. No, the deeper responsibility is different. We need to know ourselves. Not because Africa needs validation, but because ignorance of your own history makes you vulnerable to someone else's version of it. And this is where the investigation becomes uncomfortable. Because the evidence isn't only sitting in foreign museums or Western universities. There are African historians, archaeologists, researchers, and ordinary people preserving stories that never made it into mainstream history. But how much of this knowledge are we documenting? How much are we digitizing? How much are we teaching? How much are we translating? How much are we making accessible to a 17-year-old African scrolling TikTok at 2 a.m.? Because if the only place our history exists is in a dusty academic paper nobody can find, we haven't really started the job. If you believe Africa's best chapter is still ahead, kindly like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Thank you. So here's the plot twist. Maybe the biggest problem isn't that the world misunderstood Africa. Maybe the bigger problem is that Africans sometimes stopped investigating Africa ourselves. We inherited narratives. Then we memorized them. Then we passed them to our children. Then we complained that the world doesn't know Africa. Wait, who is supposed to know Africa? Us. Who should be writing the books? Us. Who should be building the archives? Us. Who should be telling the stories? Us. Not exclusively, of course. But if we outsource the documentation of ourselves, we shouldn't be shocked when someone else becomes the narrator. And this goes beyond Africa. Because there's a larger pattern here. What isn't documented becomes easier to distort. What isn't preserved becomes easier to forget. What isn't taught becomes invisible. And what becomes invisible eventually looks like it never existed. That's how historical erasure can work without anyone standing in a room saying, "Let's erase this." Sometimes nobody needs to erase anything. You simply stop recording it. Stop researching it. Stop teaching it. Stop asking questions. And eventually, silence starts looking like truth. So perhaps the question is, how do we become curious enough about ourselves to discover what we don't yet know? Imagine African children growing up not only consuming African history, but researching it, not only celebrating African heroes, but discovering forgotten ones, not only complaining about stereotypes, but producing better documentaries, books, films, databases, museums, podcasts and research. I leave you with this question. How much of Africa's story are we still calling unknown, simply because nobody has investigated it deeply enough? Think about that. There may be discoveries sitting in archives, or oral histories, or archaeological sites, or family stories, or forgotten manuscripts, or inventions nobody properly documented, or African contributions buried underneath someone else's narrative. And perhaps somewhere in all of that is an Africa we haven't met yet. Maybe it's time to switch on the light on ourselves, Africans. Because the world doesn't only need another argument about what Africa was. It needs evidence of what Africa is becoming. Because maybe, the next African Renaissance won't begin when the world discovers Africa. It will begin when Africans become curious enough to discover themselves. And if that happens, I wonder what story the world will have to learn next. So, fellow Africans, let us build the laboratory, write the book, create the technology, tell the story, and let the evidence speak. We have a responsibility to ensure the next generation learns a fuller story of Africa. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this investigation, please like, subscribe, and share to support more thought-provoking stories about Africa and the world. Some mysteries are solved, others simply become better questions. This has been African Intelligence Investigation. Not to tell you what to think, but to invite you to think differently. Until the next truth begins to unravel. Still investigating, still intrigued. The Illusionist Investigator.